In this lecture, we talk about robotics mapping. This is the second lecture on this topic. Previously, we covered occupancy mapping. So in the last lecture, we learned a basic method for reconstructing a 2D scene given rangefinder observations from a moving robot. And we talked about it that ideally you get the trajectory from the ground truth, but because we don't have that, you might run an SLAM algorithm. This is an example of pose graph. So each node is a robot pose. Because we construct this trajectory at discrete time steps, that leads to a graph. Each node is a pose at a particular time step, and then edges shows the connectivity of this trajectory. So the red edges are consecutive movements of the robot. Green edges are called loop closure. This is a topic for, this is a conversation for the SLAM lecture, but loop closures are when we revisit the same area, we establish some geometric constraints between existing nodes in the graph, and that will make the graph connectivity better, and that will help our estimation results to be better. So theoretically, the more revisiting and edges in the graph, we should get better results. We have more information. Now we solve this trajectory, and at every point, the robot observed maybe some range measurements, right? And we use known poses and observations to reconstruct this map that you see on the right-hand side. So, and we call this the occupancy grid map. Here is an example of occupancy grid map using a real data set. The data set is called the Intel data set. It's collected in an office in Seattle. It's a research lab. So a mobile robot is moving along the hallway several times and goes into some of the rooms. It's equipped with a 2D laser rangefinder. We use the same algorithm that we talked about to build a map after solving the SLAM and getting the trajectory, and then we can reconstruct the floor plan of this building for one particular floor. This is just an example of applying that method to real data. Now what happens is that ideally we would be able to reconstruct the floor as is. But because the observations are noisy and sparse, we do not have continuous observations of the structure. We just get sample points based on the resolution of our laser rangefinder. So we end up with incomplete maps or partially completed areas. So because of the noise and types of objects that we might see in the environment, maybe it was transparent in this case, and the laser was seeing through it. So we end up with incomplete parts and sometimes also areas that are very difficult because there's a wall, but also then there's free space, then there's a little wall. So these are inconsistencies in the map. It can be caused by the error in the localization, or it could be because of the inaccuracy in the range measurement, depth measurement. Our goal is to make this a little better. It would be great if we could solve it to be exactly like the real environment, but it's proven to be very difficult, so gradually we have better ideas to make it better. Now this idea has been extended to 3D. So today, we do have a library that you can run on your robot and build 3D occupancy grid map. The name of this library is OctoMap. So OctoMap is a 3D version of this 2D map that we discussed. Instead of grid cells, now we talk about volume elements that we call voxels. These are cubes. Instead of grids, we have now cubes. We call them voxels. So these volume elements, or voxels, are a way to reconstruct a 3D scene in a discretized way. So if the voxel size are very large, you get the coarse map. If they're fine, you start seeing the map to be similar to the reality, but that becomes very memory intensive because the amount of memory you need to reconstruct a 3D scene, it will grow exponentially as you add an extra dimension. So that is a problem. For example, the logo is this 3D tree that you see here. There are some examples. I believe these are from real LiDAR data. So if you have your trajectory and you have LiDAR measurements, you can use this library to reconstruct the scene like this. Now, this does not solve any drawbacks of the 2D problem. This is just a straightforward extension of it to 3D with very good software engineering, good use of data structure, and an easy-to-use API.
I was curious, does it ever happen that rather than having for your entire map a single voxel size to have a range of voxel sizes, like in the same way that humans have their word composition is not as precise as their thing that they're looking at in front of them. So is there anything like the thing that you're focusing on, you can have really high resolution, then you only kind of like half care about everything else, so you have larger size voxels for that stuff?
The question is, can we have a multi-resolution map where we have finite resolution in regions that maybe we care about or maybe we observe more frequently, more often, and having large voxels for areas that maybe we don't have any observation or maybe we want to pay less attention for whatever reason? Yes, this map, OctoMap, is like that. So the Octree data structure is precisely designed to do that. Initially, the structure is, well, this is a tree structure, so the tree structure will grow like this, right? If it's a binary tree. But this is not binary, this is a 3D space. So you start with a giant voxel and you divide it to how many? You get 2, you do another one, you get 4, and then you do another one, you get 8. Hence, Octree. So you get 8 voxel after one division. So each parent will lead to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 children. Now, if you want to do one more, you don't have to do it for every new voxels. Maybe you decide to only do it for this one. So that makes it more flexible. Probably here, there's really no need to divide the space. It's just free. One block is enough, right? And then we see the leaf node, leaf size. So what is the depth of this tree that you want to explore at most? That will be the smallest voxel you will see in your map. So that will split your space until the smallest division, for example here, has, let's say, a voxel size of maybe 0.5 meter, right? That's the size of the leaf node. So it is multi-resolution and addresses that important problem. If you don't do this, a naive just voxelization of the 3D space, it will be more intensive because we have to discretize the entire area that we want to map into tiny voxels of this size, and that's very inefficient. So that's the importance of using data structure. So, but whether 2D or 3D, they share the same problems. They're pros, they're computationally efficient because of that independence assumption. The probabilistic reasoning was for a single grid or voxel, and that makes it very fast to implement. And they are relatively easy to implement. And we do have 2D and 3D software. Now the problems are that the grid assumption makes these voxels statistically independent. So we are not able to exploit existing correlation in the environment. That means if you have a sparse point clouds, that will leave holes and gaps in the map, and the map inference by construction is incapable of completing the scene. It can only complete where you observe. It cannot interpolate between 2 points, 2 voxels that you observe and filling the gap. So having that predictability feature in the map to be able to complete at least small gaps in some regions is a desired feature. Now that becomes very important if you're operating in a large scene. LiDAR point clouds, for example, when you're at a close distance, they are dense. But as you go far, 100 meters away, suddenly they're so sparse that you're almost seeing nothing. So even though the sensor has a very long range, because these beams travel in form of a cylindrical space, they expand quickly as they go far. And that makes it a challenge to reconstruct the scenes for far distances. Bless you. Do you have COVID or regular flu?
Hopefully not. I have taken 3 COVID tests, probably. So hopefully.
Well, I'm glad you came to the class while you're waiting for the results. Don't worry, guys. You took the test. We'll see. No notion of map uncertainty. Now, we fill in the voxels with some probabilities, but we have no idea how uncertain or certain we are about that region. Because the way the inference was working was directly calculating the probabilities. The problem is these probabilities get saturated after a few observations to 1 or 0, depending on the log odds that we choose. And remember, those were tunable. Maybe you choose something that after 1 observation, it gets really close to 0 or 1. Now, then we don't have this idea that how uncertain I am for different regions. And that means that we need some notion of variance, variability for that region. Now, why do you need variance? Well, because the second order information like covariance or variance is important. Imagine a car is moving on a highway and you're detecting the car moving in front of you. If you measure the car one time to be 1 meter away and the other time is 10 meters away, where is it? The variance is super large. The average is 5 meters away. The reality is it's Maybe it's not 5 meters away. Maybe it is 1 meter away. So there's a really large uncertainty about that situation. It makes it really dangerous because which one do you want to believe? Was the 10 meters outlier or the average is correct? So the mean is very unreliable in some cases if you just want to look at that. So the mean is the location. Imagine a Gaussian distribution. The variance is the scale, how certain we are about that location. So if we know the variance is large, then we know that we lack enough information to make decisions based on that. And that will improve our knowledge of that area that is mapped.
So if we do construct maps according to uncertainty or the variance that comes with any sort of sensor measurement and update that we make, does it make sense to then construct our map not based on the mean, but any obstacle that we want to avoid is then constructed by a certain distance away from the mean dictated by the variance? So if you're very uncertain, a gigantic blob on your map then becomes an area that you don't want to navigate to, or is this still, is the information that we retain from any sort of like Bayesian update still, is the map still constructed according to the mean and then we just kind of have more risk associated with it, so maybe we don't visit it?
Okay, so the question is that, are we going to build a map just based on the variance or uncertainty, or we still need the mean when we run the inference? We still need the mean. Mean is what you visualize and you see. The occupancy or the semantic label. The variance will give you another map. You can visualize it. Of course, the robot does not need the visualization. The visualization is for us. And that variance will help algorithms in planning and decision making. Now, if your map, for example, is modeled as Gaussian distribution and you're going to plan based on the information in each region, so the entropy or the amount of uncertainty information, it is only a function of your variance. It doesn't depend on mean at all. So depending on how you model it, it can change, but generally speaking, you want that variance for decision making. That can be exploration, that can be deciding where to complete the map, and it could be the application, such something like that highway example. Maybe you're tracking a local map to track objects and you want to make decision based on that. So decision making based on the mean is a bad idea. It's unreliable. So we need an inference method that is capable of inferring that distribution so that we can talk about the variance. This occupancy mapping method by construction is incapable of giving the variance. Now, another problem is that the map has a fixed resolution. When we build it, there is no way you can increase the resolution because the data is consumed, turned into the map, the probabilities, and there isn't any way that we can increase the map without going back and starting from scratch, right? So once you build a map, the information is lost in form of those probabilities, and we cannot increase the resolution.
So when you say fixed map resolution here, I know for the OctoMap package, we talked about how it's like essentially slightly variable resolution, and that as you get more information, it kind of increases the resolution up until a saturation point. But is this essentially saying that that process of like the variable resolution can happen during mapping itself, but once that's done, you can't do anything about it?
So the question is that fixed resolution related to this multi-resolution? Now, whether you can build this hierarchy of building multi-resolution map or not, the leaf size is fixed. There is a discretization parameter, and that is fixed. What I'm talking about is that what if I make it continuous, infinite resolution? you can query anywhere you want, at any resolution you want, at any time. The question is that possible? So there should be an underlying model that is continuous, and that continuity allows us to query.
This multi-level resolution here, does it create discrimination before we start mapping or during the process of mapping?
The discretization happens as we receive data. So another question is that do we decide about this multi-resolution of the areas beforehand? No, we start from some parent nodes, maybe some rough, very coarse discretization, and then as we receive data, the algorithm will dive into each blocks. So this Octree will have different blocks in the environment, and then each block, we can find the block, and then where the measurements are falling in, and then at that point, we will decide if we need to split the resolution. Yeah. And within each block, to query these voxels very fast, we can use voxel hashing. We can use map data structure in C++ to use hash code to access them in constant time. But to query the block, to know what block we're going to operate, that requires a search in this tree, and that will cost log n. Similar to KD3, we have to pay the cost of log n to find which block we're falling in, and then within each block is constant time because of hash table. So now our goal is to address these three. We want to add some level of correlation in some neighborhoods of each voxel or cell. We want to have the notion of uncertainty or variance, and we want to make the map continuous. Let's go back and revisit our Bayes rule, because our map was using this. We started from Bayes rule. Just to review, we have a hypothesis here, the map, or the probability of each cell being occupied or not, given data. There was a likelihood model, probability of data given the hypothesis, times a prior over the hypothesis divided by some normalization constant. And what we did, because the forward model, the likelihood was difficult to model, we did a trick of defining inverse tensor model and defining log odds and all of that. Now in this case, we're going to use another idea that leads to a very efficient inference method that will also give us the variance. And that's based on the notion of conjugacy in statistics. If the posterior distribution is in the same distribution family as the prior, then the prior and posterior are called conjugate distribution. That means if your prior is Gaussian and your posterior is Gaussian, then here's a choice for the likelihood function that will allow you to have this conjugacy. Gaussian prior, proper likelihood, which is the conjugate for the prior, will give you another Gaussian posterior. So the key is that because we know the distribution of the posterior, the problem is reduced to finding its parameters or hyperparameters. The general problem in Bayesian inference is that we don't know the shape of the posterior. Now, suddenly with this way of modeling, we know the distribution of the posterior. We just need to find these parameters. And that makes it, then this brings a huge algebraic convenience, and it's computationally very efficient. Otherwise, in general, we have to do integration and all sort of inference challenges that we've seen here, and they generally exist in machine learning and other related areas. Now, the conjugate distribution is, so you can read about it here. So it's a special case of seeing Bayes rule when there are particular distributions that when they interact, we can know the result. Now, there is a table here, what is conjugate to what. We will use this Bernoulli likelihood and beta distribution for occupancy mapping, and we'll talk about it. For semantic mapping, we will use Dirichlet and Categorical. And for example, for a normal distribution or Gaussian distribution, its conjugate likelihood is again Gaussian. That's why even in your homework, the first one, when the question was solving a Bayesian inference problem, the prior was Gaussian, the likelihood was Gaussian, you just multiplied them and derived another Gaussian. Then you use this conjugacy. Somehow you proved this. For two Gaussians, you could derive another Gaussian. So this is a generalization of that rule for a variety of distributions that we know they work that way. So it's not the case always that the prior and likelihood must be the same. Some prior and likelihood have this conjugacy that the posterior will be in the same form of the prior. So the beauty of that is that the next time when the new posterior will become the prior, we can recursively just repeating this. So if I have a measurement that the likelihood has conjugacy with some prior distribution, I can recursively run this update in closed form and makes it very efficient. So this is a known result in the statistics. And statisticians notice, but it turns out it's very helpful for us in the context of mapping.
So there is no conjugacy and posterior is a different distribution, so we can't use retrospective to get what the posterior might go on changing.
The question is, why didn't we use conjugacy in the extended Kalman filter or Kalman filter? We don't know the posterior. We're trying to estimate a Gaussian approximation of the posterior. Here, by construction, we know the posterior. So the previous way of estimating is that I'm given some data, and I want to come up with an estimate. And part of the modeling choice was that if I go with an extended Kalman filter, I can track the mean and covariance. That will give me an approximation of the posterior. By no means they must have the similar distribution. And sometimes it might be a very bad idea. But here, the framework by construction is such that we know the posterior shape. Now again, whether this is a good construction for the reality or not, it depends on the problem. For this problem, we will see why this is good. So the Gaussian distribution is a conjugate prior for the likelihood that is also Gaussian. For example, if you want to map for substance concentration, then we can use this type of mapping. You send a robot, you want to monitor, you want to measure the concentration of a gas, for example. Maybe there's a gas leakage somewhere. You send a robot to monitor. Maybe you have a sensor, you can measure the intensity in some small area around the robot. Now, one measurement is obviously not good. You want to move around, collect as many measurements as you can, and then reconstruct the distribution over the spatial area, the area that the robot is exploring. then it makes sense to use a Gaussian prior, maybe Gaussian likelihood, and we can keep adding information to each voxel to model the concentration of that substance. So in environmental monitoring tasks, this can be helpful. In the context of occupancy mapping, we're dealing with a discrete case. We already know that a cell is occupied or not. So that makes it binary. So Bernoulli distribution, Bernoulli likelihood is for the binary case. But what is the prior or posterior? That's what we need to look into. Beta distribution. Somehow we are informed that there is such a distribution in the statistics. It's called beta distribution. What it does, it places a probability distribution over the probability of two events. Two events here being probability of being occupied and the probability of being free. Depending on, it has two hyperparameters, or parameters, alpha and beta. Based on different values, it can get different shapes. Now there's an animation here. So when this alpha and beta changes, this distribution can switch between event 0 and event 1, right? We have two events, each side. And then this curve is telling us how much of the mass of the distribution is on which event in a continuous way, because it's not that it's bimodal and switches between events. It continuously distributes a mass. Now, if it's halfway, that means that both are equally possible, and that's where we don't know if it's occupied or not. All right. So when it's bell curved, you can imagine that's probably our prior when we start. Now, what's the equation for this distribution? So you see the last line in this equation. There's a normalizing constant. You can ignore that. Then it says that x is the event. Here is being occupied or not. So it's occupancy. Raised to the power of alpha minus 1 times 1 minus x times beta minus 1. So that's just the shape of that distribution mathematically. So you knowing alpha and beta, when you evaluate this at different places between 0 and 1, right? 1 was occupied, 0 was free. We get different weights for this likelihood. And different alpha and beta will give different shapes. So this seems to be a reasonable statistical model for the prior and posterior to define the occupancy, because we know we're dealing with a binary case. Now the conjugacy comes in when we choose a likelihood that is Bernoulli. A Bernoulli likelihood is a probability mass function that it gives you a probability of P. Let's say if the event is 1, is true, and it gives you another probability which is 1 minus P if it's false. You toss a coin, right? You get head and tail. You can model that the measurements of tossing a coin using a Bernoulli distribution, which in the limit you expect it to be 50-50 if it's a fair coin. Can you model a die with Bernoulli? No? Why not? Yeah. So we have 6 possible states. not two. It's not just occupied, unoccupied. And Bernoulli seems to be not sufficient. We need something more general. And we will see in the categorization, scene segmentation, we need a more general form of that, which is just a straightforward generalization of this idea. And that's called categorical distribution. So it's not just two. It's not binary. It's categorical. There are k possible outcomes. So with this choice of modeling, we're going to go and model occupancy maps. Later, we generalize beta to Dirichlet and Bernoulli to categorical. Dirichlet distribution is a generalization of that beta distribution. When it's not just two events, we have more than two. Now it's general. It doesn't have to be three, although the visualization is for three. We can have arbitrary number of outputs. Now, if this arbitrary number goes to infinity, then it's continuous, and that's something that is called Dirichlet process. But that's not we work with in this case. So we have, now you can imagine a triangle, and we have three categories. Then the mass of the distribution is such that it shows the amount of weight on each event. And if it's equally distributed, that makes them equally valid. As you can see, different shading. Or maybe it is concentrated around one particular event. And we will see how this comes handy when we want to talk about semantic mapping. The categorical is the generalization of the Bernoulli distribution. So in this scenario, instead of two probabilities of p and 1 minus p, we have k probabilities, but such that some of them will add up to 1. Right? So it's a discrete probability. It needs to add up to 1. And the reason we will use this probability because it also models something that we call one-hot label. So the labels that we deal with are 0 and 1, the measurements. The segmentation that we do, it's telling you it's either occupied or not, right? The point that you read from the laser, there's no ambiguity. If there is a measurement, you know that's an obstacle. Ignoring that maybe there are outliers, maybe they do some filtering on the raw measurements and so on. So you label it as occupied, 1. And then the probability that that particular measurement is free or belongs to any other category is 0. So the sequence of labels will be all zeros unless for one particular category that you think that's the measurement from. That's called one-hot encoded label. We'll talk about that again more when we talk about the semantic mapping. So the result that this setup will give us will enable closed form and recursive Bayesian inference. When you hear Bayesian inference, that means we infer the distribution, not just a point, a mean. This is an example of a map that we can build. It's here on campus. This is around the wave field behind the aerospace department. So the Bayesian inference via conjugate prior is, if we formalize it, it's like this. The first part is that we have labels that are in this form, assuming we have k categories. Now, when I say categories, you can think about maybe sidewalk is category 1, grass is category 2, wall is 3, trees are 4. Somebody walking here in red, maybe we call this 5. There are more, but we just don't see them here. I think on the actual robot, it was something between 10 or 20 categories that we could map. But it was fixed. The robot, and that's the problem. The robot would not be able to add a new category on the fly. That's a big problem. If we can solve that, then we really have the next generation of perception in this area.
You need to have like a default category or something?
We can. The question is, do we have a default category? It's always a good idea probably to have other or default category and add whatever we are uncertain or doesn't fit into the other one to that category. Because all of these categories, now the visualization changes a little bit in 3D because all of these semantic categories are occupied. So even that default or other will be occupied. We just don't know what concept to assign to it. The robot is not familiar with that. So it reduces, that other or default will reduce to the occupancy map, because if this was the occupancy map, all of these categories will be just occupied. So it's just free and occupied. And in 3D, it's just hard to visualize free because you won't be able to see the map.
So do we use this category segmentation to decide the resolution of that part in mapping?
Question is, do we use the categories to decide the resolution? I believe we don't do it here in this results that I show you, but it is a good idea because sometimes based on what you observe, maybe there is really no need for fine resolutions. That's a good idea. Now you're immediately thinking that how can I use this categorization to do more? And that's basically the idea, because the map is suddenly so much richer. It's not just occupancy. We can assign concepts, and that concepts help so much for the robot to decide. For example, we were tasked the robot to walk on the sidewalk. Don't go on the grass. Stay on the sidewalk, do a loop autonomously, and then build a map. We have a video, we can talk about it more. So back to the derivations. So we have k categories in general. They must add up to 1. And each of them, it can be only 0 or 1. So that means there's only one of them that is 1, right, with these constraints. Because they add up to 1, and they can only be 0 or 1. For any map voxel, we want to estimate this vector of probabilities. So we have k probabilities. So we track 1 probability per category. And that's what we did before as well. We had a probability of occupancy. Because it was binary, the other one is 1 minus occupancy. But because we have k categories, now we have to track 1 probability per category. But of course, they need to add up to 1. The degree of freedom is k minus 1. It's not k. Now, if the likelihood is categorical, given the parameter that we want to model, so the probability of data given the hypothesis, which is the likelihood, is just the product of these theta values raised to the power of their measurement. Now, because all of them are 0 except one of them, This, let's say we have a measurement of category 3. This will basically collapse to this, right? So the likelihood is, this just fancy way of writing makes it consistent that when we want to evaluate, it will return the probability of that category, if that is the observed category. And if it's not, it won't contribute. So that probably won't appear here.
Could you explain why the measurement is one hot encoding vector? It seems intuitively the theta vector makes sense in terms of your measurements. You have a probability distribution over each measurement, but I'm not really understanding why it's just one hot encoded for the measurements for each category.
The question is why one hot encoded measurements? What if we get a vector of probabilities as measurements? The answer is that this is more convenient. We can get the argmax of that vector of probability and do these derivations. If we want to work with that probabilities, we need to, then the categorical likelihood won't be valid. The conjugacy won't be valid. Then we have to look into different models. It is possible, but that will be a generalization of what we talk about. So this is a simpler case when even if we get the output of the softmax layer of a neural network, for example, for segmentation, we take the argmax of that to turn it into a categorical measurement. Okay?
So is this essentially like an argmax operation that we're describing that?
If y, the measurement, comes in form of probabilities, we take the argmax to see which one is 1, and the rest are 0. Right? We turn them into decisions. They're hard labels instead of soft labels. So that's the likelihood. The Dirichlet distribution has, which is the probability of the parameter or posterior parameter given data. This is prior. Still don't have data, but this is just to emphasize that there are some hyperparameters, and that's how we are modeling the distribution. So given alpha as hyperparameters because they're not theta. Theta is actually the parameter. Alpha is the parameter of the prior. Then we call it hyperparameters to make sure it's clear that we're not talking about these outputs that are parameters. Okay? So the Dirichlet distribution has a normalizing constant that you can ignore. And again, it's the product of all categories raised to the power of alpha k minus 1. That's how it's defined. So the posterior from the conjugacy, we know that the posterior, which is of course proportional to the likelihood times the prior, we also know that it will be a Dirichlet distribution. So once we know its hyperparameters, new alpha values, there's no ambiguity how to reconstruct the whole distribution. We can look at the shape of it, and we know the normalizing constant, and we have the full solution. Now, a direct calculation by multiplying the categorical likelihood times Dirichlet prior, it shows that we just multiply these theta values, and the power will be raised to alpha plus y minus 1. So we learned that if we have a Dirichlet prior and do an update this way, using a categorical likelihood, we just count numbers. We're just counting the number of measurements from that category that we observe. Which is simple. We can just count, and you can define the sum to be like this. And if you go back to the Wikipedia page, we can show that the expected value and variance are possible to derive in closed form, and it's very simple. This mean is just saying that divide each alpha by the sum of other alphas. That will be the probability of that category. And the variance has this form you see here. So we are able to talk about the mean and variance for each category.
Does this mean that, like, if you want to add additional semantic classes, that it's not possible to do that because you can't update your past probabilities?
Good question. The question is that what if we want to change, because right now what we're talking about, the number of categories, this is constant. If you want to make this variable, it might create some conflict with what you observed previously, right? And it might create some inconsistency with how we integrated past information. We are not doing that, and that is an open problem. I think we can come up with clever ideas, but keep in mind that we want to also do it as the robot operates. I think it's okay to solve the problem offline because we want to understand it. But there's also a really hard challenge to change these categories as the robot observing the scene. Just understanding that part is the open problem. If you do know that from the observations, then that makes it so much easier. Okay? The core challenge is that the robot does not understand maybe that particular category because the perception system is probably incapable of detecting that type of object or category. So at this point, we pick a maximum set that we know and we can handle, and we just operate with that. So if it's less than that, that's okay. More than that, it's the problem. Now, if k equals 2, that will reduce to the occupancy case. The categorical will look like the Bernoulli likelihood, a binary likelihood, and the Dirichlet will be reduced to beta distribution. So that's the inference. It's not too bad. Much better than an invariant Kalman filter. So we call this counting sensor model precisely because we're counting measurements for each category. So that's the name for it. If we build an occupancy map of the same area using this method, now we still need to implement an algorithm that loop over map points and see if they're in perception field, see if that cell must be updated or not, but we covered that already, right? The part that we're going to replace in the algorithm is how we update the belief or probability for the map. So the occupancy map will give you the mean, but also the variance that you see here. The variance is relatively higher in areas that are incomplete. So if a robot wanted to explore, we would know that we should go to areas that they have higher variance. That could guide your decision making. Now, the original data set is not semantic. Last year, Cynthia, my PhD student, segmented this data set for you. So the way she did it she decided that if the robot walks, not walking, it's a wheeled robot. If the robot moves in the hallway, this is one segment of the map. So all the observations that the robot observed by moving along the hallway is this blue, dark blue category. The room in the east, west, north, and south, they have different colors. The center area, it has a different color. So the robot starts from this green rectangle, it goes around, explores, and comes back in the end to the same place. So on the left side, you see all, in this figure, you see all the point clouds, 2D point clouds, with their categories. So we turned an occupancy data set into a semantic data set. It has categorization. This is a good toy problem to test our semantic counting model. Now, if we use more than 2 categories, what we will see is that the free space is, of course, its own category. So by the way, you have k categories plus 1, right? That's the free space. So the other k categories are occupied points that we see, and they have different colors. So the counting model will somewhat help with the averaging, because if you have contradicting labels, we're just going to accumulate, and based on the frequency of observation, it will get the probability that it's occurring the most.
When it comes to like choosing the number or choosing what like each of those categories would represent, is there like, I know you described how it's just like there's hallway and then cardinal direction center for like the categories here, but is there any sort of like a notion on how to set and define those categories?
Question is there a rule, a guideline, that we define the number of categories? I brought a secret book of categories here. Oh, I left it at home. So to finish this lecture, I have to tell you that there is no rule for categorization of the scene, because no matter what I choose, you can increase it or reduce it. So it is, again, it is an open question how to do it. In reality, we have infinite categories. But it's hard to work with that, because that makes it very challenging to come up with simple algorithms. But also, we are limited in practice with the number of categories that we can actually detect. So take this trade-off that at any point, what's the progress? How many categories we can actually detect? Whether that's the object, scene segmentation, deep learning, geometric method for segmentation of the floor, ceiling, whatever it is, right? Put all of that together, maybe you get 30, maybe you get 100. 500, something like that, right? Now, does it make sense for the robot to categorize 500 labels? A lot of time it doesn't, maybe it does, depend on the application. So based on application, you can engineering that, right? So I guess that comes down to your intuition as an engineer that you're designing that.
I guess it's like a quick follow-up to that. Is there situations where in more safety critical settings, it's like more, it's just important to essentially create categories to go and say like for autonomous driving for like humans or something? Is that more of an engineering problem then too?
That's a good point, that whether in some applications like self-driving cars, we need some regulation that maybe, well, the minimum number of categories that your self-driving car is built on, you must recognize people, other cars, bicycles, motorcycles, traffic signs, things like that. I think that makes sense. I don't think there is any regulation at this point. But also our algorithms detect all of them. So there isn't any method that is not aiming to detect this many categories at least. So the semantic segmentation of an image or a scene is a problem in that sense, that how many categories we choose. Now, the way I got a resolution for myself, because that question was haunting me as well, to the point that, is this the right direction? Because there's a clear question, there's a specific question that I'm not able to answer. The way I could give an answer to it is that this categorization is human understanding of the scene. If I want the robot to understand the scene the way I do, I can categorize it and label it for the robot. Then it makes sense, again, any number of categories, but even if I choose 10, that's a minimal set of my understanding of the scene that I'm transferring to the robot. So that somewhat is a little more satisfying. We are transferring our scene understanding part, scene understanding knowledge to the robot. Does that make sense? And another way to fix this. Can't remember. Can't remember. We have to move on. So continuous mapping. So that whatever we talked about was still discrete. We're counting labels. Still have questions?
Just about the graph in the previous slide. So what they kind of stood out, this is maybe a little specific, but towards the top right of the constructed map is a very thin line that indicates that there was kind of a scan that maybe got through. I don't know, it's around like on the x-axis, yeah, exactly there. So this seems to me that at least looking at this as a person, this might be some sort of sensor error. And the pure reason why I say this is because in the general vicinity of this sensor output, there is no other reading with that same kind of distance. But when we go to the map that shows us the variance or the confidence in the measurement that's made, it has the same associated variance. It's nearly zero as the other ones. So
well, right, because even though this could be a glass, right? The laser beam is going through the glass or any transparent object. And behind the glass, maybe there is a wall. So the robot does not understand that, and that's a valid range measurement, and anything along that beam is modeled as free, which has low variance because it was free. And it's a problem, right? But it's not a problem of the algorithm. It's a problem of higher level lack of understanding. Because the algorithm is just consuming data that you give it, and it will doing the correct job. But it's not intelligent enough to understand that, well, there's a glass, and that's outside of this region. I only want to build a consistent area of this region. And there is no connectivity between that, what I see outside of the glass and this inner area. And maybe I point out in the end to scene graphs. We have a slide on that. So that brings us more to the current challenges in robotics, that there is a need for higher level scene understanding. It is not enough to just go around and build metric maps. So we need more than that. This is a good example of that. So I would say the algorithm is doing its job. It's just not designed to solve that problem. And it will limit the scene understanding capability of the robot. So we fixed the problem of What did we fix? I have to go all the way to the back, to the beginning. Grids were assumed to be statistically independent. Did we solve this? We did? Please elaborate how we did that. We didn't. We're still just counting measurements in one grid. This is another way of inferring the map. We did solve this uncertainty problem. So 1, 2, 3. Next idea will fix 1 and 3. If we make the map continuous, meaning it considers correlation, local correlation for inference, but also it gives you a continuous model so you can query, it will fix the first and the third one.
Could we say the fact that we have these semantic IDs or these, the way that we're kind of classifying each measurement that we have, would that be some sort of dependence across the measurements that we make?
The categorization are not dependent. We treat each measurement as a statistically independent measurement. The measurements that we use are conditionally independent given current map. So we are treating them as independent observations. That's what we do in localization, and that's what we will do in SLAM as well. Now, it is true that these beams that we have on a LiDAR, they might be correlated because, after all, they are just observing maybe the same wall. There are some research to how to build a better model that correlates your measurements for a laser scanner or LiDAR to give you a better model. It is possible to do that. It will make it much more complicated. If you won't get anything nice like this. This is extremely simple to implement. If you need to run a Gaussian process or a neural network to just capture that correlation, this closed form Bayesian inference is lost. But there are papers on that idea. So the idea, it turns out, to make the map continuous, we can go several directions. One early idea that I worked on it for a while as well, was to use Gaussian processes. Now, although Gaussian processes are dealing with Gaussian priors and Gaussian posteriors, they're not limited to Gaussian likelihoods. These models can handle different likelihoods. If you want to know more about it, this is a great book. There's software, and that's what I read to learn machine learning for the first time. I started reading this book. It's very clear, and I highly recommend it. So Gaussian processes are not scalable. That's the problem. Now, what is a Gaussian process? So whenever you assume your posterior parameters, here map, all the voxels, are jointly distributed according to a Gaussian distribution. So if your variables follows a finite dimension of Gaussian distribution jointly, that by definition is a Gaussian process. And there are ways to model and run inference. There are good libraries for that. This falls into the class of kernel methods in machine learning. That was the previous big thing before deep learning. But this cubic complexity, because we need to invert the matrix of the size of the training data. If you have 100,000 points and you want to update the map, or if you have 10,000 points, we're not going to be able to invert a 10,000 by 10,000 matrix. Plus, that's an overkill because probably the correlation that we want is locally. It is nice to have some global correlation, but locally will take us a long way already, based on what we have right now. So the next idea that is an approximation to the Gaussian processes is done in this work, and it's called Bayesian generalized kernel inference. Now, it's a work that for exponential families of distribution, it will drive a model that will bring in a kernel, and that kernel will show up in that categorical model. And then when we run the same calculations, the result is that to update the posterior hyperparameter, we just need to weight each measurement by its correlation with its neighbor using this kernel. The kernel that you can model, it's up to you. And the default can be this Gaussian kernel or radial basis function kernel. It's a Gaussian-shaped bell curve that we can model the correlation between the current voxel and then points around it. So the consequence of that, and the kernel is something that it takes 2 points, evaluates that Gaussian kernel, and it gives you one number between 0 and 1. So it's adjusting weight to each measurement. So now instead of associating that measurement with the voxel that it falls in, we can use that measurement to update a neighborhood based on where the LiDAR point is, where the voxel center is. And that distance is captured inside this radial basis function. So the closer they are, you get the full version of the measurement. It's close to 1. If you're very far, maybe you get 10% of it. And that brings some form of continuity, a statistical correlation that is locally now is in the model, in the model that we use. Now, another consequence of this is that now if X is, let's say if one of them is the location, 3D location of the LiDAR point, there isn't any limitation where to query. You can query any point in the space to know its distance to that observation. So that makes the map continuous. Now the underlying model is not tied to a discretized representation, although we might choose to work with those voxels still, because it's convenient. But in principle, this asterisk means that we can query any point. Any point in the space that you want to know the effect of this measurement, we can query that. And as usual, you can, as before, you can get the mean and variance. So this simple idea will help us to make the map continuous. Now, I'm giving you the consequence of using the result in this paper. But the results are easy to interpret. It's just the kernel with neighborhood weighting. So now we're talking about continuous counting sensor model using that kernelized form. Now you can go back and compare this kernelized map. It's not widely different, but it does give you a smoother map. Some of the edges are smoother. If you have contradicting measurements, this kernel tends to have a spatial smoothing effect. So over your map coordinates, it will enforce some sort of smoothness. And you are able to increase the resolution if you want to at any time. The library that I'll give you, I don't think it has zoom and enhance. Maybe you can add that option using this model. You can do the same thing with the semantic version of that. And similarly, it will have the smoothing effect. Now, this is your homework, right? So your homework is to implement these 4 figures that I'm showing you. The counting model with just a discrete version of counting model, the semantic version, then the continuous version, which is a simple extension of the original counting model. So the homework that we'll give you next for mapping, homework 6, is about using this data set and replicating figures that you see here. Once you implement the 2D version, then I trust you that you're ready to use the open source library in 3D. That's your extra credit. So you have to run that open source on a data set and prove it to me. Now, one question is that where the hell we get the semantic labels? It's not like the sensor is giving it to us. Right? So going back to that question, that if it's our construct, makes it very difficult to use physics to measure that. That's not going to be something that we can measure it physically. So that's a problem, but luckily we're going to rely on some advances in computer vision. If we use 2D images, for example, if it's a stereo camera, maybe you do image segmentation on the left image, and then you get your point cloud, and you know already the pixel coordinates for each point, and then you read that from the segmented image. If it's RGBD, it's even nicer because there's a one-to-one correspondences between points in 3D and pixels on the image. Now, every month there's a better network, right? So this area is super active. I'm just giving you some examples. Every year, every month, we have better networks, better results in this area. There's also a nice data set that is called Semantic Kitty. So the Kitty data set was for self-driving cars. Then some people did the job of labeling all the LiDAR points in this data set. So now you have ground truth and point clouds with nice semantic labels. And there's a competition having the network that can label point clouds in 3D. So this is different from 2D image segmentation because we have to label LiDAR point clouds directly in 3D. There's no color information. So necessarily, this is a supervised task. So it's a supervised learning problem. Because if you make it self-supervised or unsupervised, then there's that question of how many labels and what they mean. So it's hard to rectify that. So some of you, I believe, will use this data set in your projects. So we can use 2D segmentation and 3D segmentation. You can think about all of these algorithms, advances in 2D, 3D computer vision as better way of getting measurements for your mapping algorithm. So each segmented point cloud is a snapshot, a scan of the semantic map that we want to construct. Obviously, if the labels are noisy, as they will be if you're training a network and want to deploy it, then a single frame decision making based on what you get from a prediction of a neural network might be unreliable. Whereas this way of multi-frame accumulation of the labels in this counting model will make the scene segmentation more reliable. because now we look at the window of time and the frequency of labels that we observe. And if there's any outlier or false positive or mistake, hopefully it will get rectified. So the performance should be better always theoretically because, and it is using data because we're just accumulating more data. So this has this notion of single frame and multi-frame mapping. We're going to watch some videos. I always wanted to show videos instead of teaching. Here is our chance. Maybe next lecture I show you a movie instead of optimization. And hopefully that will improve my rating. Tell you Gauss, Newton, and Lie group, then you will hate me. But 3 years after that, you will email me. I get emails later. It's too late. I missed that rate already. So all these ideas, we worked on it from 2017 to 2020. So about 2020, we could run this experiment on campus. That's Cassie Blue, made by Agility Robotics. So in Professor Grease's lab, they work on control. So they could walk the robot. We were collaborating on adding the perception to the robot. So the person burst behind the robot is just for safety. The robot is walking autonomously. It's tasked using a simple planner to go around the sidewalk. The way the robot knows the sidewalk is using this map. So this is around the wave field. You could see the image that what robot sees is super blurry and shaky. The segmented image using a neural network is very noisy because we had to label a small data set on campus ourselves. There isn't any labeled data. And you will be amazed that the trajectory that you see, it is only dead reckoning using an invariant EKF. It's not a SLAM. But the tracking is good. There's a height drift, but the top view is very consistent. So the height drift is caused by some factors. One is the contact point that we assume in the model. In reality, the robot it doesn't have foot point, it's a line. So it can have some differences. The kinematic calibration might be imperfect. There are some sources of errors, which that learning that in the first lecture I talked about it helps with some of the height drift when we bring in learning for this state estimation problem.
So here semantic segmentation was done using camera measurements. Is it possible to do with both camera and data measurements?
So here we use the image from the camera to perform semantic segmentation. Then we project LiDAR points to the camera. We had to solve the calibration problem to know the relative rigid body pose between the camera and the LiDAR. Then we use that extrinsic transformation to map points to the camera frame. Then we use the camera projection model to map the LiDAR point to the image, and then we read the label on the image. Then we end up with 3D labeled point cloud from LiDAR. And that's how we built this map. We could use the RGBD camera as well, but that's not very good for outdoor. We've done that. It won't be as good as LiDAR, of course.
Was this work done like offline? Did you need to go and
Online. We're mapping online here, right?
Okay.
It's
so
easy.
you're able to figure out what things, like is there some interaction online? You have to label something at some point, but once you've done that, you can do everything online.
So the map runs at 2 hertz, roughly, not entirely real time. The LiDAR comes at 10 hertz. The robot needs to make decisions, so it is online. But if we have recorded data, you can easily run it offline.
So you have to disregard LiDAR points that are out of the field of view camera, right? So
Right. That's a problem, right? Good question. So good comment that because the field of view of the camera is limited, the image is not seeing everything that the LiDAR is seeing. So what happens is that all the points that are outside of the field of view, they get discarded. Or you don't get a label for them. You can use the point in the map, but we don't get labels. So there are practical challenges. Can we apply labels later? How much later? We need to make a decision. We can only wait so much until the robot is on grass instead of sidewalk. It depends how fast you're moving. If this was a car, the speed can be much higher. This is relatively slow. So 2 hertz wasn't too bad. So for the continuous semantic mapping, you can go to this library. This is on Dr. Lu Gan's Git. She was my PhD student. She graduated. So there are some images, and you can run this using ROS and different data sets like Kitty. Now there's an occupancy version of that we built on this second library. The occupancy version was done. We used that and we converted to the semantic version. We have also extended this to dynamic. Now we're not covering dynamic mapping, but we talked about this, that now if a car is moving here, and the map is static, it assumes the board is static, it's going to leave long traces in the map. And it becomes overconfident until you re-observe it enough to balance the measurements. So in this work, we added a prediction part to this map updating using labels, and the way it works is that there's a simple autoregressive process model that takes the scene flow, 3D flow, so it knows where objects are moving, and uses a norm of the flow to mostly downweight the labels. So it will try to prevent the map from becoming overconfident. And as a consequence of that, now we can roughly track these objects. And the traces are gone. So accuracy-wise, now there was a challenge to how evaluate dynamic maps, because accuracy-wise, it's similar. But if you look at precision, the precision is so much higher because all the free areas are modeled now correctly. But it's hard in a lot of data sets to evaluate it because a lot of data sets are built for static maps. If you just concatenate all the frames using the ground truth trajectory, you do see the trace. So the data set makes it difficult to evaluate the true performance of a dynamic map. So we've done a new work that builds the data set and also makes this using deep learning as a local mapping. It's not public yet. When it becomes public, I'll share that with you, maybe within a month or so.
For this sort of effort where you use optical flow information, do you also need the robot's ego motion or the relative transformation of the robot as well to be able to incorporate this information?
We do, because the scene flow includes ego motion. We need to compensate that, so what's left are the objects. that are moving in the sensor frame. Yeah, the visual flow or the 3D flow of data includes ego motion as well. And by that, I mean if the environment is static and we're moving, as if the buildings are moving with the opposite speed, whereas the buildings are static. So we need to compensate that to get zero flow for the scene. So now this is a very simple idea, but it shows that it's possible. The consequence of that is that we get higher precision and we can see the objects are moving as they do. It is a simple extension of this first library. So that's for the algorithms that we want to cover. There's a lot to think about and read in this area. This is a very attractive area because maps are usually nice to visualize and easy to communicate about them because we can show people. They have a lot of applications as well. So there's a very old paper by Professor Kuipers. He's in Michigan. And I don't think he was in Michigan at the time. In 1982, he has a paper called the map in the head metaphor. It's about different literatures and different ideas about the cognitive map and how we perceive these spatial areas and maybe the topological understanding of the scene. Maybe this is a good read if you like to read about the concept. It's not about an algorithm. This is a concept paper that talks about different ideas. He has another paper that is more recent by his group, 2009, so somewhat old, but it's still very relevant. Then they talk about this hybrid spatial semantic hierarchy. This is also interesting to read because semantics are not just scene categorization. That's a very narrow way of generalizing the map from occupancy to semantics. There's this notion of topological understanding of the scene, just being able from metric map realizing a graphical reconstruction of the scene to know these are rooms, this is a building, this is a highway, maybe this is a cafe. How can we do that? Objects. So this notion of semantics can be so much richer, and this hierarchy in this paper is talking about different ways of thinking about it. So again, it's an interesting paper to read. But also I should point out that in a lot of robotics literature, the semantic is used and referred to these objects and categorization. So that what they're really pointing out, they're pointing out to tools that we have and we can use. It's less about concept, whereas in artificial intelligence literature, maybe they are more concerned about the way of understanding the semantics and how we define it. So a very general way of talking about semantics is the idea of affordance. Affordance means the utility of perception. So if I see an object, I can assign a value to it, and that will be the utility of that object for me. And the reason you're looking at me now, you're not looking behind yourself, because I am talking and I'm drawing your attention, and all your affordance is gone to this area. So this notion is very important for object manipulation, grasping, and generally interacting with environment and people. So this is a generalized notion of semantics, affordance, which means the utility of perception. Something more recent from Professor Carlone's group at MIT, this 3D scene graph is very nice because they modernized some of the ideas in the literature and they added more features and knowledge and with a good presentation. To have a modernized way of visualizing and understanding the scene. Now the proposal here is that to have 5 layers. The first layer is this metric semantic map that we talk about. So what we talked about is really this first layer of reconstructing the floor or scene. The representation can be mesh, can be voxels. That's not, it's important, but that's not necessary. It's not necessary to commit to that for talking about this idea. The layer 2 is about objects and agents. The layer 3 that they introduced is about places and structures. Layer 4 is about rooms. Layer 5 is the building. So that can give a way of building this map. Now, this is at this point is offline. I think it's undergoing some work to be online, to be a real-time way of mapping. It will be interesting to have something like that. This is not the end of it. This is the beginning of it. We're still trying to see how we can build this sort of map using the robot and how the robot can use it, act based on it. It's an ongoing research in the robotics community. So the simulator has also people walking around. Because it's simulation, you can have access to labels. It makes it easier to maybe solve a slam. Now, by the way, we have a plan to have a guest lecture by Tony, the first author of this paper. If everything goes well, we will have a guest lecture, and I think he's going to talk about this work or his research around this area. So stay tuned. Okay, so watch this later at home. There's a paper as well. I encourage you to look at the paper. These are some reading and references that you can take a look. They're in the papers because they're new. They're not in the textbook. The occupancy mapping is in the probabilistic robotics book, but the rest are in the literature. You can read it from the papers. So that's the end of the robotics mapping lecture. Have a great break. Next time we'll talk about optimization or watch a movie.